Her arms were stretched forward. That detail, buried inside a Soviet forensic report that sat classified for 3 decades, is what broke this case open for me. Zina Kolmogorova, 22 years old, found face down in the snow, 850 meters from the camp. Arms extended, fingers pointed back toward the tent. She had been moving toward it. Whatever drove her out into minus 30-degree temperatures without her coat had at some point during the night become less terrifying than what she left behind. And she had turned around. She never made it. February 1959. The Ural Mountains, Soviet Union. 9 experienced hikers, students and graduates of the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk, had set out for the peak of Otorten in the northern Urals. The word Otorten, in the language of the indigenous Mansi people, that translates roughly as, "Don't go there." The group knew this. They used it as a joke. They were not beginners. Their leader had organized expeditions before. Several members held the second highest Soviet hiking certification. They had filed the proper paperwork, planned the proper route, done everything correctly. On the night of February 1st, they pitched their tent on the open slope of a peak called Kholat Syakhl, Dead Mountain, and went to sleep. By morning, all 9 were dead. The tent had been cut from the inside, not torn. Cut. Someone inside that tent took a blade and opened the canvas and climbed out into temperatures below minus 30 Celsius, without boots, without coats, without adequate clothing of any kind. Some were found in a single sock. Some wore one shoe that belonged to someone else. They walked down the slope in the dark. All 9. The Soviet investigation lasted 3 months and produced a conclusion that reads less like a finding and more like a surrender. The hikers had died as a result of an unknown elemental force. Filed, stamped, forwarded, and then sealed, classified, withheld from public access for 30 years. Not inconclusive. Sealed. I have spent 2 years on this case. That distinction is the only thing that has never let me go. Igor Dyatlov built things. Not figuratively. He designed and hand-constructed a small radio transmitter before the expedition, a device to send progress reports back to the Ural Polytechnic Sports Club. He tested it before departure. He packed it carefully. But his friends described him as methodical in a way that looked effortless, the kind of person who checked the equipment twice and never mentioned it. He was 23 years old. He carried a camera. All 4 of the group's cameras were recovered from the tent. The photographs, developed by Soviet investigators, show the group at various points along the route, smiling, laughing, caught mid-motion, as they actually were. The final frames show them setting up the tent on the slope, hands busy with ropes and poles. There is nothing wrong in any of them. I have looked at them many times. No shadow, no dark edge. 9 people making camp. That is all. Zina Kolmogorova was 22. She kept a journal throughout the trip. Her final entry, written the evening before she died, has been described by everyone who has read it as routine. She recorded the day's distance, the weather, the group's mood. She noted plans for the following day. The tone is light. The handwriting shows no sign of hurry. She was found 850 meters from the tent. Face down, arms extended toward it. The forensic examination determined she died of hypothermia. No significant external injuries. She had been alive long enough after leaving the tent to cover 850 meters through deep snow in inadequate clothing at temperatures that can kill an unprotected person in under an hour. The position of her body, the direction of her arms, point to one conclusion. She was trying to come back. Lyudmila Dubinina was 20 years old. She was found last, in May, when the spring thaw uncovered a ravine roughly 75 meters from the cedar tree where 2 others had died, while she was partially submerged in running meltwater. Her injuries were of a different order than hypothermia. Multiple rib fractures, bilateral, both sides, multiple ribs each, hemorrhaging into the heart muscle, damage to her internal organs, consistent, according to the medical examiner, with force comparable to a high-velocity vehicle impact. Her skin was unbroken, and there is one additional detail from Dubinina's forensic report, stated plainly in the same dry bureaucratic register as the rib measurements and hemorrhage notations. Her tongue was absent, her eyes, part of her lips, soft tissue, missing. The medical examiner attributed the missing tissue to decomposition, water action, and wildlife during the 3 months between death and discovery. This is the official position. The same examination found no comparable decomposition in the surrounding soft tissue of the face and neck. They left Sverdlovsk on January 23rd. By February 2nd, they had missed their first check-in. By February 20th, search parties were formally deployed. On February 26th, the tent was found on the slope of Dead Mountain, half buried in drifted snow. One wall collapsed, the cut in the canvas visible from a distance. Their footprints, all 9 sets, led down the slope toward the tree line. The footprints were calm. That is the lead investigator's own language. No running, no stumbling, no divergence. 9 people walked deliberately down a dark slope in lethal cold, without their coats, and their footprints looked like a group that had decided to take a walk. I've lived with that image longer than I care to admit. The walking, but the calm. I still don't know which possibility I find harder to accept. That something in that tent left 9 rational people choosing -30 degrees as the safer option, or that the choice was never really theirs to make. The first explanation, the most recently published, most widely cited, most institutionally credible, is an avalanche. The logic is coherent. The campsite sat on a slope of approximately 28 to 30 degrees, within the range considered avalanche-prone. The hikers pitching the tent may have destabilized the snowpack above them. A small slab could have struck while they slept, crushing the occupants, filling the interior with compacted snow. Someone conscious enough to hold a blade cut through the canvas because it was the nearest exit. That 9 people woken by an avalanche fled without thinking about boots, because the tent had become a place that was trying to kill them. The fractured ribs, the skull injuries, compressive snow loading produces this exact damage profile, internal trauma with skin intact, because snow distributes pressure differently than solid impact. The 2019 Swiss Federal Institute for Snow and Avalanche Research built a simulation using the 1959 meteorological data and concluded a small delayed slab avalanche was physically possible, and that the injuries were consistent with compressive force. The study was published in a peer-reviewed journal. It generated significant coverage. For a moment, the theory felt settled. Then read the original investigation report. At the team that reached the campsite on February 26th, 26 days after the deaths, documented no evidence of avalanche debris, no displaced snowfield, no fracture line above the campsite, no runout deposit. The tent was partially still standing. A slab powerful enough to bilaterally fracture ribs on 2 people and produce skull fractures on 2 others would bury the tent. It would not leave it standing in undisturbed snow 3 weeks later. The 2019 Swiss study acknowledged, in its supplementary materials, that no physical evidence of an avalanche was found at the scene, attributing the absence to elapsed time and subsequent snowfall. That acknowledgement is in the technical appendix. The press summary does not mention it. The avalanche theory explains the broken bones. It explains the flight. But it cannot explain Zina Kolmogoreva's arms. If an avalanche struck that tent, she was crawling back toward the avalanche zone. Under the force of what compulsion? No version of this theory has ever addressed. There was a restricted zone in the northern Urals in 1959. Soviet records released after 1991 confirm a classified military presence in the region during this period. The precise nature of what was being tested remains partially classified. But in the same era, Soviet engineers were developing parachute-deployed munitions designed to detonate above a snow surface and generate a pressure wave capable of disabling armored vehicles. These weapons produced catastrophic internal injuries through overpressure, ruptured organs, fractured bones, hemorrhage. They left no marks on the skin. The lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, who ran the official inquiry, produced the unknown elemental force conclusion, filed it, and said nothing publicly for 31 years. In 1990, as the Soviet Union was opening its archives, he gave an interview. He stated that senior officials had traveled from Moscow to review his investigation. That following those visits, the direction of the inquiry changed. That he had been instructed to attribute the deaths to natural causes. He did not name who gave the instruction. He stated he personally believed the deaths were connected to military operations in the area. He said he had encountered evidence he was told to set aside. He did not specify what that evidence was. Ivanov's 1990 interview is on record. His claim that he set aside evidence has been cited widely. A review of his declassified files, portions released in 2019, contains no reference to military activity in the area, no record of the Moscow visits he described, no indication of what he set aside. If evidence was removed before declassification, there would be no record of its removal. There is no record of its removal. The theory accounts for the injuries in a way the avalanche cannot. It accounts for Ivanov's behavior, the sealed files, the 30-year silence, the conclusion that reads like deliberate closure. It even explains the calm footprints. People who have experienced an overpressure event describe a period of dissociation before pain arrives, a suspension of normal cognition. You walk because you have not yet understood what has happened to your body. The fear response has not caught up, and then you return to the missing tissue. A pressure wave does not remove soft tissue selectively. It does not take a tongue and leave surrounding muscle intact. It does not remove eyes without damage to the orbital structure. No overpressure mechanism produces the specific pattern on Lyudmila Dubinina's face. The most institutionally coherent theory in this case, the one with documented support in Ivanov's own words, fractures completely against this single detail. Whatever happened to her face happened selectively, specifically, in a way no recorded weapons test or accident has ever produced. A researcher named Igor Pavlov published findings in the years after the Soviet collapse, suggesting the topography of Kholat Syakhl created conditions for periodic infrasound events. Acoustic waves below the threshold of human hearing that generated by wind passing across the mountain's specific geometry, the same principle that makes certain spaces resonate, but at a frequency the ear cannot register. Infrasound. At around 18 to 19, Hertz produces, in documented controlled studies, a consistent set of effects: acute anxiety, panic, spatial disorientation, visual disturbance at the periphery of vision, and a powerful, wordless conviction that something is wrong, something is present, something is coming. Subjects cannot name what they fear. They know only that they must leave. The hypothesis reframes the departure from the tent entirely. Not escape from something external. Flight from inside their own nervous systems. Yet the tent had become intolerable. Not because of what waited outside it, but because of what the mountain was doing to the air inside it. And 9 experienced hikers cut through the canvas because remaining felt like dying. They walked calmly because infrasound does not produce directed fear. It produces unfocused dread. You do not run from it. You simply move. Away. This is consistent with Mansi hunters, who have avoided Kholat Syakhl for generations, and whose oral tradition describes the mountain's air becoming dangerous in certain wind conditions. It is consistent with the calm footprints. It accounts for the absence of any visible external threat. The Soviet government commissioned classified research into infrasound effects on human behavior, beginning in the early 1970s, is under a program dealing with what the documentation termed environmental stress thresholds. Several academic papers citing this program appeared in Soviet journals between 1971 and 1978. Those papers are listed in the Soviet National Library catalog. The journals have been digitized. When researchers access the specific issues containing those papers, the pages corresponding to the articles are blank. Surrounding pages are intact. The catalog entry exists. The content does not. The infrasound theory is the most behaviorally elegant explanation in this case, the one that best accounts for why 9 rational people walked into lethal cold without a word. But infrasound does not fracture ribs. It does not produce skull trauma. It does not, under any documented frequency or duration, remove soft tissue from a human face. 3 theories. 3 collapses. The same 3 facts still standing at the end of each one. The internal injuries with unbroken skin, the calm exit, and the condition of Lyudmila Dubinina's face when the snow gave her back in May. Nobody talks about the radiation. In the spring of 1959, as the investigation was concluding, forensic specialists tested items recovered from the campsite and from the bodies. Standard procedure. The tests included a radiological examination. 2 items of clothing, a sweater and a pair of trousers belonging to separate members of the group, returned elevated radiation readings. Significantly elevated. The levels recorded were high enough that, under Soviet occupational safety guidelines of the period, prolonged exposure would have constituted a health risk. Not ambient background radiation. Readings that, by the standards applied to workers in Soviet nuclear facilities, would have triggered a formal incident response. The finding is in the investigation file, recorded with the same flat bureaucratic precision as the rib measurements and the weather observations. No alarm, no elaboration. The clothing was tested. The readings were noted. The investigation concluded. The file was sealed. For 30 years, no one outside the investigation apparatus knew the radiation readings existed. In 1959, the Soviet nuclear program was at its most active and its most opaque. The Ural Mountains were not peripheral to it. The closed city of Chelyabinsk 40, now Ozersk, housed one of the Soviet Union's primary plutonium production facilities, roughly 300 kilometers south of the group's route. 2 years earlier, when the facility had experienced a catastrophic explosion, the Kishtim disaster, releasing radioactive contamination across a substantial portion of the southern Urals. The Soviet government suppressed all information about it for decades. Western intelligence agencies did not make public confirmation until 1976. Kishtam is not the obvious explanation for radiation on clothing found 300 kilometers north 2 years later. But it illustrates the specific context. The Ural Mountains in 1959 were a landscape where radioactive contamination was possible, covered up as policy, and never acknowledged until the Soviet Union had ceased to exist. The radiation doesn't solve anything. It breaks everything simultaneously. If it was an avalanche, snow loading does not produce radiation signatures. Why were specific garments radioactive? But if it was a military test, was the weapon itself radiological? Soviet tactical development in this period was not limited to conventional munitions. That documentation remains largely unavailable. If it was infrasound, the radiation has nothing to do with infrasound. It suggests a second factor that no environmental explanation touches. The radiation is not an answer. It is a door. And what makes this case different from other cold case disasters is that the door was locked from inside a filing cabinet, and by the time anyone was allowed to look, the people who locked it were dead or silent. Lev Ivanov gave his 1990 interview when he was elderly, and the system that had instructed him to file a vague conclusion and seal the evidence was visibly ending. He said he had been told to attribute the deaths to natural causes, but he said he believed the deaths were connected to military activity. He said he had set aside evidence on instruction. He died in 1997. He never specified what the evidence was. He never mentioned the radiation readings in any recorded interview. We know where they camped. We know where each of them died. We know the order the bodies were found, and their condition, and how long each person was alive after leaving the tent. We know someone cut the canvas from inside, and that 9 sets of footprints walked calmly down a dark slope. We do not know what they saw when they cut through the tent. We do not know what made cutting through it the better option. We do not know what Zina Kolmogorova decided, 850 meters from camp, that made her turn around. We do not know what happened to Lyudmila Dubinina's face, or why 2 garments were radioactive, or what Lev Ivanov was told to set aside. These are not open questions in the sense that research might eventually close them. They are open in the harder sense. The people who knew are gone. The documents are sealed or altered, and what remains is a forensic report, 4 rolls of developed film, and a filed conclusion that says, unknown elemental force, and was never meant to be questioned. I started this case as a skeptic. 2 years later, I believe the investigation found something and was told not to follow it. I believe the sealed files contained more than what was released in 2019. I believe Lev Ivanov knew what happened, and died without saying it clearly enough for anyone to act on. That is not a conclusion. It is where the weight of this thread has deposited me, after following it as far as it goes. Tell me which you find harder to accept, that 9 people died in the Ural Mountains in 1959, and the Soviet government had no idea why and sealed the files anyway, or that the Soviet government knew exactly why, sealed the files for 30 years, and the explanation has still never been made public. Her arms were stretched forward. She was trying to get back.